When he gave her an emerald bracelet, she was too shocked to understand. Trying desperately not to hurt him, she pleaded that she could not accept it. "Why not?" he asked. "It isn't as if you were a bad woman, paying the usual price for it. Are you afraid that I'll start making demands? Don't you trust me?" He laughed aloud at her stammering embarrassment. He smiled with an odd kind of enjoyment all through the evening when they went to a nightclub, and she wore the bracelet with her shabby black dress. He made her wear that bracelet again on the night when he took her to a party, a great reception given by Mrs. Cornelius Pope. If he considered her good enough to bring into the home of his friends, she thought, the illustrious friends whose names she had seen on the inaccessible mountain peaks that were the society columns of the newspapers, she could not embarrass him by wearing her old dress. She spent her year's savings on an evening gown of bright green chiffon with a low neckline, a belt of yellow roses, and a rhinestone buckle. When she entered the Stern residence with the cold, brilliant lights and a terrace suspended over the roofs of skyscrapers, she knew that her dress was wrong for the occasion, though she could not tell why. But she kept her posture proudly straight, and she smiled with the courageous trust of a kitten when it sees a hand extended to play. People gathered to have a good time would not hurt anyone, she thought. At the end of an hour, her attempt to smile had become a helpless, bewildered plea. Then the smile went as she watched the people around her. She saw that the trim, confident girls had a nasty insolence of manner when they spoke to Jim, as if they did not respect him and never had. One of them in particular, a Betty Pope, the daughter of the hostess, kept making remarks to him which Cheryl could not understand, because she could not believe that she understood them correctly. No one had paid any attention to her at first, except for a few astonished glances at her gown. After a while she saw them looking at her. She heard an elderly woman ask Jim in the anxious tone of referring to some distinguished family she had missed knowing, "Did you say Miss Brooks, of Madison Square?" She saw an odd smile on Jim's face when he answered, making his voice sound peculiarly clear. "Yes, the cosmetics counter of Raleigh's 5 and 10. Then she saw some people becoming too polite to her, and others moving away in a pointed manner, and most of them being senselessly awkward in simple bewilderment, and Jim watching silently with that odd smile. She tried to get out of the way, out of their notice. As she slipped by along the edge of the room, she heard some man say with a shrug, "Well, Jim Taggart is one of the most powerful men in Washington at the moment." He did not say it respectfully. Out on the terrace, where it was darker, she heard two men talking and wondered why she felt certain that they were talking about her. One of them said, "Taggart can afford to do it if he pleases," and the other said something about the horse of some Roman emperor named Caligula. She looked at the lone, straight shaft of the Taggart building rising in the distance, and then she thought that she understood. These people hated Jim because they envied him. Whatever they were, she thought, whatever their names and their money, none of them had an achievement comparable to his. None of them had defied the whole country to build a railroad everybody thought impossible. For the first time she saw that she did have something to offer Jim. These people were as mean and small as the people from whom she had escaped in Buffalo. He was as lonely as she had always been, and the sincerity of her feeling was the only recognition he had found. Then she walked back into the ballroom, cutting straight through the crowd, and the only thing left of the tears she had tried to hold back in the darkness of the terrace was the fiercely luminous sparkle of her eyes. If he wished to stand by her openly, even though she was only a shop girl, if he wished to flaunt it, if he had brought her here to face the indignation of his friends, then it was the gesture of a courageous man defying their opinion, and she was willing to match his courage by serving as the scarecrow of the occasion. But she was glad when it was over, when she sat beside him in his car driving home through the darkness. She felt a bleak kind of relief. Her battling defiance ebbed into a strange, desolate feeling. She tried not to give way to it. Jim said little. He sat looking sullenly out the car window. She wondered whether she had disappointed him in some manner. On the stoop of her rooming house, she said to him forlornly, "I'm sorry if I let you down." He did not answer for a moment, and then he asked, "What would you say if I asked you to marry me?" She looked at him. She looked around them. There was a filthy mattress hanging on somebody's windowsill, a pawn shop across the street, a garbage pail at the stoop beside them. One did not ask such a question in such a place. She did not know what it meant, and she answered, "I guess I haven't any sense of humor. This is a proposal, my dear." Then this was the way they reached their first kiss, with tears running down her face, tears unshed at the party, tears of shock, of happiness, of thinking that this should be happiness, and of a low, desolate voice telling her that this was not the way she would have wanted it to happen. She had not thought about the newspapers until the day when Jim told her to come to his apartment, and she found it crowded with people who had notebooks, cameras, and flashbulbs. When she saw her picture in the papers for the first time, a picture of them together, Jim's arm around her, she giggled with delight and wondered proudly whether every person in the city had seen it. After a while, the delight vanished. They kept photographing her at the dime store counter, in the subway, on the stoop of the tenement house, in her miserable room. She would have taken money from Jim now and run to hide in some obscure hotel for the weeks of their engagement. But he did not offer it. He seemed to want her to remain where she was. They printed pictures of Jim at his desk, in the concourse of the Taggart terminal, by the steps of his private railway car, at a formal banquet in Washington. The huge spreads of full newspaper pages, the articles in magazines, the radio voices, the newsreels were all a single long, sustained scream about the Cinderella girl and the Democratic businessman. She told herself not to be suspicious when she felt uneasy. She told herself not to be ungrateful when she felt hurt. She felt it only in a few rare moments, when she awakened in the middle of the night and lay in the silence of her room unable to sleep. She knew that it would take her years to recover, to believe, to understand. She was reeling through her days like a person with a sunstroke, seeing nothing but the figure of Jim Taggart, as she had seen him first, on the night of his great triumph. "Listen, kid," the sob-sister said to her when she stood in her room for the last time, the lace of the wedding veil streaming like crystal foam from her hair to the blotched planks of the floor. "You think that if one gets hurt in life, it's through one's own sins. And that's true in the long run, but there are people who'll try to hurt you through the good they see in you, knowing that it's the good, needing it, and punishing you for it. Don't let it break you when you discover that." "I don't think I'm afraid," she said, looking intently straight before her, the radiance of her smile melting the earnestness of her glance. "I have no right to be afraid of anything. I'm too happy. You see, I always thought that there wasn't any sense in people saying that all you can do in life is suffer. I wasn't going to knuckle down to that and give up. I thought that things could happen which were beautiful and very great. I didn't expect it to happen to me. Not so much and so soon. But I'll try to live up to it." "Money is the root of all evil," said James Taggart. "Money can't buy happiness. Love will conquer any barrier and any social distance. That may be a bromide, boys, but that's how I feel." He stood under the lights of the ballroom of the Wayne Falkland Hotel in a circle of reporters who had closed about him the moment the wedding ceremony ended. He heard the crowd of guests beating like a tide beyond the circle. Cheryl stood beside him, her white-gloved hand on the black of his sleeve. She was still trying to hear the words of the ceremony, not quite believing that she had heard them. "How do you feel, Mrs. Taggart?" She heard the question from somewhere in the circle of reporters. It was like the jolt of returning to consciousness. 2 words suddenly made everything real to her. She smiled and whispered, choking, I'm very happy." At opposite ends of the ballroom, Orrin Boyle, who seemed too stout for his full-dress clothes, and Bertram Scudder, who seemed too meager for his, surveyed the crowd of guests with the same thought, though neither of them admitted that he was thinking it. Orrin Boyle half told himself that he was looking for the faces of friends, and Bertram Scudder suggested to himself that he was gathering material for an article. But both, unknown to each other, were drawing a mental chart of the faces they saw, classifying them under 2 headings which, if named, would have read Favor and Fear. There were men whose presence signified a special protection extended to James Taggart, and men whose presence confessed a desire to avoid his hostility. Those who represented a hand lowered to pull him up, and those who represented a back bent to let him climb. By the unwritten code of the day, nobody received or accepted an invitation from a man of public prominence, except in token of one or the other of these motives. Those in the first group were, for the most part, youthful. They had come from Washington. Those in the second group were older. They were businessmen,